A businesswoman stands frustrated at the carousel of a European airport. Her luggage hasn't turned up. She's going to be late for her meetings, which she had to reschedule anyway. An elderly man sits alone. He hasn't seen anyone for days. He's finding it harder and harder to fulfill the basic functions of life. Out beyond the town, a village lies abandoned. Its last inhabitant has moved in with her daughter since her neighbour died. In a bus station in Lagos, a young man turns up with few possessions and directions on how to find an uncle who's going to give him a bed for the night and maybe introduce him to a friend who will find him a job. Scratch beneath the surface, and almost everything in life is in some way related to demography, to the science of population, to births, deaths, and migrations. It's true of the past, from the rise and fall of great powers to the causes of wars and their outcomes. It's true of the present, everything from rising interest to the rise of the Nigerian film industry. Perhaps some of you remember learning something about the Reverend Thomas Malthus in your school days, or maybe something about the demographic transition. But for most people, it's not something they're very aware of. The number of children who die before their first birthdays. It's about 10 per thousand in Peru, or about 1%. Back in 1950, it was 15 times that number in Peru. Today, Peru has achieved what the UK managed as recently as the early 1990s. In traditional societies, 1/3 of children died before their first birthdays. 2/3 before they could have children of their own. And that's why we didn't have a population explosion until the modern era. With all those extra young lives which would have been snuffed out and which continue, we have massive population growth. And nowhere do we see this more than in sub-Saharan Africa. By the end of this century, there will be 4 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa. In 1950, people in Africa represented perhaps 7% of the world's population. By 2100, they're going to represent more like 37%. If you think this isn't going to transform our world, the balance of power, the global economy, international culture, think again. But of course, when traditional societies have a population explosion and the rural economy can only absorb so many hands, you get urbanization as people head to the cities. Now, back in 1914, there were only 12 cities in the whole world with more than 1 million people. Today, there are 120 in China alone. And it's not just a question of where people live in a block of flats in a suburb or out in a village, because rural people and urban people have different lives, different work, different aspirations, and critically, they have different demographic behavior. The fertility rate, the number of children the average woman can expect to have in her life, in Singapore is about 1. That means every 2 people are producing 1 person. Every cohort, every new cohort, is going to be half the size of the previous cohort. And it's not just true of Singapore. You can walk all the way from the Straits of Johor between Singapore and Malaysia to the Straits of Gibraltar at the other end of the Eurasian landmass and travel only through countries where the fertility rate is below replacement level, too low for the population to sustain itself numerically in the long term. It's true of increasing numbers of countries and cultures. And it's not just true of rich cities like Singapore. Poorer cities like Addis Ababa in Ethiopia or Kolkata in India have below replacement fertility rate. The fertility rate in Calcutta, the number of children per woman, is not much higher than it is in Singapore. If you're having fewer and fewer young people, and people are living longer, you will eventually get aging. The median person in Catalonia, if you lined up the whole population and you took the age of the person in the middle, that median person would be aged about 43. Now, you may remember back in 2017 there was a referendum. There was a vote in favor of independence. It was rejected by Madrid. There were some scuffles in the street, but there was very little violence. Nobody took an Armalite up into the Pyrenees to kick off a battle or a civil war. Why was that? Well, a number of reasons, but not least among them is how old the population is in Catalonia. People were too busy paying their mortgages or sitting in the sun drinking their espressos. Compare that to the Catalonia that George Orwell described in his famous book set in the 1930s, a Catalonia which was descending into civil war and chaos and anarchy. Key difference, back then the median age in Catalonia was a lot closer to 23 than 43. Older people tend to be less warlike, more law-abiding, and the sorts of societies that have older people are different. But as you get a rising median age, you often tend to get a growth in the number of the very old, which brings me to my sixth number. Back in 1950 in Japan, there were probably about 100 people aged over 100. Today, we're heading rapidly for Japan having 100,000 centenarians and growing rapidly. And Japan is the vanguard, but it's not an outlier. Much of the world is following in Japan's footsteps. It's no coincidence that the country with the oldest population is the country with the highest debt to GDP in the rich world. The Japanese government finds it harder and harder to pay the pensions and for the health care of its burgeoning number of elderly, with fewer and fewer young taxpayers. But long life is a wonderful thing we should celebrate, and Japan is at the forefront also of innovation and investment in finding ways to use technology to help the elderly to live more dignified lives without an army of younger people to look after them. But however long we live, very few of us make it beyond 120, practically nobody. So eventually, ultimately, a population starts to decline, which brings me to my seventh number, Bulgaria. Between the 1980s and the 2080s, it's forecast that the population of Bulgaria will fall by 55%. Bulgaria is a perfect storm. Very little immigration, very high emigration, as Bulgarians are in a poor country and they can leave to go to better paid jobs in places like Vienna. They're in the EU. And years, decades of fertility rates below replacement level. But Bulgaria is far from alone. The whole of the Balkans is seeing a declining population. And major countries like Russia and Japan and very soon China will see their absolute number of people reducing. And countries like Germany already have more deaths than births and would have a declining population were it not for mass immigration. But with mass immigration comes rapid ethnic change, which brings me to my eighth number. In California, the population was well over 80% so-called white in the middle of the 20th century. These categories change. There's no reason, for example, that someone whose ancestors came from Andalusia should be considered Latino, and someone whose ancestors came from Sicily should be considered white. But however you cut it, the fact is massive ethnic change is happening in California because there is mass immigration. And today in the schools in California, which of course suggests what the future will be like, barely 22% of the students are categorized as white. Now, some people may celebrate and like that fact. Others may quietly or noisily dislike it. Others may be made uncomfortable, even discussing it, and wish to stick their head in the sand. But whether you like ethnic change or dislike it or wish to ignore it, it's coming to a city in the developed world near you. I want to talk about two other numbers which are not strictly demographic, but are nevertheless important to this system I'm describing. The ninth number is education, because whatever happening quantitatively to humanity, human beings are going through an extraordinary qualitative upgrade. And you can see that in the literacy rate in Bangladesh. Back in the 70s, when Bangladesh won its independence from Pakistan, barely 1 in 5 women could read and write. Today, it's more like 70%. rising fast, and almost universal among young women. And if you look at the other end of the educational spectrum at university attendance, back in the early 80s, almost nobody in China went to university, and today half the cohort do. So mankind is going through this extraordinary qualitative upgrade, making people very different and far more able to take on high-paying and productive jobs. My final number is 370, which is the percentage increase in the food output of Ethiopia. Now, those of us old enough to remember the 1980s can recall the tragic faces of starving children in Ethiopia on our television screens. We don't see that anymore. What's changed? It's not just the removal of an incompetent and corrupt communist government in Ethiopia. It's also the fact that the Ethiopians have proved extraordinarily successful, as have so many people in the developing world, at increasing their food output. Thomas Malthus was wrong. He thought we were going to end up with an endlessly upward-moving population, high fertility rates, an unstoppable force pushing against the immovable object of limited resources. In fact, what's turned out to be the case is we've been fantastically successful at increasing our resources, while at the same time very successful at controlling our fertility in ways that Malthus could barely have understood.